people make, right? And they count all it up. And they tell us that there are, what is that number there? 46.2 million Americans in poverty. That's individuals and families and counting all the children and all the family members. 46.2 million Americans in poverty out of 306 million Americans in total. About 15%, 15%. Now that means that they make less than this much money. That's what that means. There's that many in poverty. Now the Census Bureau tells us how much they make, and they tell us what the gap is to get them out of poverty, to make this much money. And that's where the Census Bureau leaves it. And that's where nerds like me come along and say, well, gee, I wonder what that totals. And when you total that up, it's $165 billion. So our government tells us that to solve poverty in America, it would cost $165 billion. That's the second figure I brought to you tonight. And yet, if you remember the first figure, we spent $358 billion. Now how can that be? That drives me nuts. CPAs don't like that kind of thing. And that's what really brings me here today, is that we have a hard time evaluating what we're doing with the poor. We have a hard time quantifying or calibrating all of these costs. But when you compare them to the government's own measure of poverty, it starts to bring it all into focus. And you say to yourself, how is it that we have 46 million people in poverty, and yet if we were to move them out of poverty, it would cost us $165 billion, but we're spending $358 billion every year on 12 programs. How can that be? Why does that happen? Where does that money go? And I've studied it, and I'll share with you what I know about it, and then we can answer some questions in a minute. Did you have?
Yeah, was I sleeping, or did I just miss something here? They're saying it can take $165 billion to get them out of poverty, but to what extent? $1 more than what they say is poverty?
Equaling to these numbers.
Oh, I missed that. Okay, $1 more to get all these people out of poverty would pull $165 billion.
Yep. Yep. So in other words, some people are at zero, so they would an individual at zero would need $11,139. But if somebody's at 10,000, they only need $1,139 to get out of poverty. They go through and add all that up for all 46.2 million people, and they report how much individually those averages are. And then I just can come along and do the math. It's very simple math, and it totals $165 billion. The federal government never publishes that. I don't know why. I've not seen it in very many places. I've tried. It's why I'm here today, is because it seems like such a simple thing to have out there in the public, to understand what it would take to end poverty as defined by the government. Again, you can argue with these numbers, but it's a very interesting number, isn't it? We have a lot of poor people who make very little, and we have people who make, steadily up the income ranks. Where is it that we're trying to help them? What are we trying to do here? And when we just have these programs that are unrelated to one another, it ends up just being a lot of money that goes out the door. And we'll talk about now, where does it go? Why is the 358 so much greater than the 165? Who's getting that? Who's getting it? And the first place it goes is our own programs. Our own federal government has defined some programs that should go to people greater than these poverty numbers. And that's in the little green there. So where do all the extra dollars go? The first place they go is to persons with incomes above the poverty level. So SNAP, for instance, is aimed at, you qualify if you're 130% of poverty. Not 100%, but 130%. Why is that? It was just Congress in their wisdom decided that those numbers in red were too low, so they said 130%. But the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children, shows you there, it's 185% of poverty. Well, why is that? Well, again, that was a program created at a separate time, and in Congress's wisdom at that time, they felt like milk and cheese to pregnant moms and 5-year-olds should be at 185% of poverty. Now, isn't that interesting? That's the same food. right? So on the one hand, if you have a 6-year-old, you can only be up to 130% of poverty, but if you have a 5-year-old, you can get that milk at 185% of poverty. All 12 programs have different qualification standards. There's no consistent qualification, and they're not all based on the poverty level. HUD does, what HUD does is looks at a mean income in a locality, and you have to be 50% of that. So they all have 12 different standards, and they don't talk to one another, and the conclusion is that we are inconsistent in our definition of who is in need.
So we're trying to get rid of excess cheese off the market.
It might be, but I think that's not how they sold it, but it could be. Okay, so that's item number 1. That's where the money goes. Sometimes we actually aim at people above poverty. Item number 2, where actually there's more money spent, or that explains the difference between the 358 and the 165, is that some people start out in a poverty status, but they get so many benefits that it takes them well above the poverty number. Let's talk about that one for a second. If you're a family of 4 and you're at $20,000 of income, you qualify for most of all of this. So if you get SNAP, maybe now that puts you at $24,000. And then if you get housing, now maybe you're at $28,000. And etc. And you get moved well above the poverty threshold. Now, that's probably not intended, but none of these programs talk to one another. There's no cap on the number of programs you can be in. There's no cap on the amount of benefits you can get. And the benefits that you receive from a federal program isn't even included in your income when you apply for another one. That make sense? Let me give you an example. Let's take 3 families. And these families have a mom and dad and 2 children. So they're a family of 4. One family makes 0, doesn't have a job. The next family makes $20,000 in annual working wages, and another family makes $35,000. Otherwise, they're identical. The family at 0, just with the top 3 welfare programs on this page, would get about $19,000. Food and housing mostly. Okay? Now, they're still under the poverty threshold, aren't they? Because $22,000 is poverty. They would get 19 just from those first 3. The family that made $35,000 gets virtually 0. They might get a little bit of EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit, back from the federal government, but it wouldn't be very much. Now let's talk about the family that made $20,000. They're only $2,000 below the poverty threshold, but they would get $15,000 in benefits from the top 3 programs, EITC, housing, and food stamps. Now think about that one. They were only $2,000 shy, but they got $15,000 from just those top 3 programs, and they could also get school lunches and WIC and all these other sorts of things. That's an interesting thing, because the family that made $35,000